In Samuel Shim's famous The House of God, the hero, the fat man, says to interns, I'm not crazy. I just spell out in my feelings what every other doc suppresses. They squash the feelings down and it eats away at their guts. When I rounded out oncology in 1977 for my medical initiation, I began to understand what the fat man meant. So this is Great Stories in Bioethics, my personal YouTube channel. And today is the story of how I got initiated into some of the more grisly aspects of medicine. Before I taught my first class in the fall of 1977, my clinical mentor, Kurt Avon, thought I should get some experience in medicine, a no-brainer. So he arranged for me to round that summer in various services. And the first month was with oncology, which was in the old Helmand building of our hospital, the 14th floor. We had one of the nation's few comprehensive cancer centers. That also meant that we got some of the so-called non-responders as patients. So on my first day in June of 1977, I met various patients on the service, some in their 20s, some in their 80s. By chance, this was the month that Dr. Floremeyer was on call as the attending. He was known for his meticulous detail and attention to detail of various complicated protocols that he was running, mainly for leukemia and multiple myeloma. It's also unfortunate that Dr. Floremeyer was probably on the spectrum. He could see 20 miles ahead of everybody about the protocols and that occupied 90% of his brain. But unfortunately, that large part of his brain that was focused on that sensory detail took away from the parts of his brain that might have been focused on social interaction. He was pretty cold with many of the cancer patients. When most rounds lasted 45 minutes or an hour, the residents told me, watch out for Floremeyer because it's going to be a 3-hour slog. And sure enough, sometimes it was 3 hours. If we would start at 8, sometimes it was 11:30 before we could break for lunch. On most of the fellows, they were very attentive. The residents, of course, had to be. The med students, they all were to learn things. I was the only one with nothing to do. And into the sea of misery, I was inserted, and I did often yearn for something to do because, everybody else had a job, the nurses, even the housekeepers. So mostly the team ignored me. This was partly passive-aggressive because they hadn't chosen for me to be there, but I had nothing to do. So I just kind of observed. And back then, there was no discussion of patient rights or Kubler-Ross or Medicare versus Medicaid or conflicts of interest. I instead was like, I guess, a pre-med shadowing. I was just left to soak up, feeling-wise, all the misery. And the cancer ward filled with people in stage 4 non-responsive cancer. When I left the rounds, whether it was at noon or at 11:30 at night, I felt like the hospital had been a giant dementor. It just sucked all the feelings out of me. And it was not a great feeling. I had no one to talk about it to except for my wife, Pat, who sympathized, but she wasn't going through the same thing. The worst thing was when someone died, which often occurred around 4 a.m. And when I got there the next morning, there'd be a new patient in the bed. And the team had already worked up a new admit, and no one talked about the patient who had died. The whole thing had been forgotten, exercised, cleaned up. Rounding on the other services was somewhat better, but not too much better. One time in a hallway connecting services, I saw an attendant pushing a patient in a wheelchair who'd had a hemochlorrectomy. In other words, he had been cut off below the waist. He was a thin black man, wildly gesticulating, maybe psychotic. Very, very disconcerting to see him in such a state. Most of the patients I saw suffered medically from terrible conditions. They were in congestive heart failure, end-stage diabetes. They suffered strokes and had massive hypertension. I saw people undergoing nephrology. I saw an amniocentesis, but I didn't see a lot of progress. If I had felt optimistic starting rounds, when I left, I felt pretty pessimistic. So one of the more interesting things was how each month, when the attending changed, everyone changed. The attending was the guy who ran the service. And, you could always tell someone's status by the length of the coat. I mean, medical students were in short white coats, residents were in longer coats, staff and doctors were in longer coats. Dr. Dean Pittman had a white coat that trailed down to his shoes. And of course, the nurses and housekeepers were in pastels, all this indicating your status. But I remember one month when the residents were kind of kidding me, and I said, I took it for tomorrow. Oh, what do you mean? Oh, you'll see, they said, giggling. So the next day I met Jean Boudreau, a hungover, grouchy professor who always would arrive with a 64-ounce mug of coffee. He would scratch his hair and dandruff would fall out. He just looked like he was completely out of it. At first I thought he was so hungover that he would be incompetent, but then he would zap one of the residents with a question they couldn't answer and put them on their toes, and then we would move on to the next room. I also rounded with an attending I called a giggler, a very strange person who appeared to think of himself as a comedian and also his own audience. So he would tell a joke, make a remark, I took away, and then react as if he was the audience for the joke. I took this to be a defense mechanism against the day-to-day misery that he was seen as a cancer doctor in charge of all these non-responsive patients. So I did this every morning for months, and I didn't see much progress. It was just a lot of misery. If I had known something then about advanced directives or conflicts of interest in other cases, I might have had something to teach. I might have had a role to play. But back then, all I could do was feel what was going on, mainly feel for the patients. And it wasn't a great experience that way. I now see why it's good for people who want to enter medicine to shadow. It's not like on Grey's Anatomy. I'm glad I did it. I learned a lot, but I wouldn't want to do it again. That's it for today. I hope you learned something. Share, give me a thumbs up. See you next Tuesday.